The day Harold told me he was leaving, he wore the diamond-studded platinum watch I'd given him for our golden anniversary just 8 weeks earlier. He stood in our marble-floored foyer, designer luggage stacked by his Italian loafers. The same luggage we'd taken to Tuscany last spring, and informed me that our life together had been a comfortable arrangement that had run its course. 50 years of marriage reduced to a dismissive corporate euphemism while his 32-year-old executive assistant, Veronica, waited in the Range Rover outside our gates. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply nodded and said, "I hope your new arrangement brings you everything you truly deserve." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Harold didn't know as he walked out was that for the past 20 years, I'd been quietly crafting a financial safety net that would eventually encompass his entire portfolio. My name is Eleanor Blackwell, and at 68, I never expected to reinvent myself. My 3 children are grown with successful careers of their own. My 7 grandchildren are the lights of my life. I have gray in my hair that I don't bother to color anymore, arthritic fingers that sometimes ache when I type, and a mind as sharp as it was the day I graduated with honors in economics from Wharton in 1978, a fact Harold and his high-priced lawyers would soon come to understand all too well. I'd met Harold in 1972 at a campus mixer when I was a sophomore, and he was a charismatic MBA candidate that everyone predicted would revolutionize the financial world. He had a confidence that bordered on arrogance and ambition that seemed limitless. I was the quiet, methodical one who could analyze market trends with uncanny accuracy, who professors called brilliant but fellow students rarely noticed. We were an improbable match, the boisterous future titan of Wall Street and the reserved data analyst who preferred spreadsheets to socializing. But when Harold needed help with his master's thesis on emerging market vulnerabilities, a complex topic that required statistical modeling beyond his capabilities, our paths converged. I spent weeks perfecting his analysis, translating his ambitious theories into viable mathematical frameworks that elevated his thesis from speculative to groundbreaking. The night before his defense, we stayed awake until dawn, and as the morning light spilled across his scattered papers, he looked at me with something close to awe. "You're extraordinary, Ellie," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." 3 months later, he proposed with his grandmother's emerald ring and the promise that together we would build a financial dynasty. Our early years were lean, but purposeful. We rented a modest apartment in Riverdale, a neighborhood with overlooked potential that Harold insisted would transform within a decade. While he secured an entry-level position at Bergman Investments, I worked as a risk assessment specialist at Metropolitan Insurance, learning the intricate architecture of corporate portfolios while planning our future. Each evening, we spread financial papers across our secondhand dining table, him with investment prospectuses, me with actuarial tables, plotting our ascent. Our first significant investment was a struggling tech startup purchased with a loan secured against my inheritance from my grandmother and Harold's relentless negotiation skills. "We need to start where others fear to tread," he would say, eyes gleaming. "The overlooked opportunities, the undervalued potential, that's where true wealth begins." He was right. That first investment tripled within 3 years, providing capital for a series of increasingly successful ventures. By our 10th anniversary, we had established Blackwell Strategic Investments. My name appeared on the corporate documents, but not in the company title, a detail I overlooked at the time, as my focus remained on the analytical framework that supported Harold's increasingly bold market plays. Our roles seemed clearly defined and complementary. Harold was the visionary, the face of our growing firm, while I managed the risk assessments, structured the complex investments, and ensured our expanding portfolio remained profitable even during market downturns. When our first major hedge fund closed at a record profit margin, it was Harold who rang the ceremonial bell at the exchange and shook hands with the mayor. I stood 3 steps behind him, smiling appropriately, content in knowing that without my risk algorithms, that fund would have collapsed during the sector correction 6 months earlier. That evening, as we celebrated with champagne in our newly acquired penthouse overlooking Central Park, he kissed me deeply and whispered, "We're unstoppable together, Ellie. You're the foundation beneath everything I build." For decades, this arrangement functioned seamlessly. Blackwell Strategic grew from regional prominence to international significance. Our children, Jonathan, Margaret, and Elizabeth, attended prestigious universities and pursued careers of their own choosing. Jonathan became a neurosurgeon at Mayo Clinic, Margaret a federal judge in Boston, and Elizabeth an ambassador currently, stationed in Singapore. They visited when they could and called often, their lives expansive and independent, just as we'd raised them to be. By our 35th anniversary, Blackwell Strategic had expanded into 15 countries with signature investment, vehicles that transformed portfolios from Tokyo to London. Harold's reputation had grown legendary, the visionary financier who anticipated market shifts before they materialized, who structured deals that somehow always favored his clients while maintaining cordial relations with all parties. I remained his silent partner, the analytical wizard whose risk assessment strategies enabled his seemingly prescient market moves. At industry events, I was introduced as Harold's wife, despite having designed the proprietary algorithms that powered our most successful funds. Perhaps that should have bothered me more than it did. But I found satisfaction in the elegant mathematics of our success, in watching my financial models materialize into thriving portfolios and secured futures for our clients. When Harold received the Lifetime Achievement Award in Global Finance on our 45th anniversary, he thanked me briefly as my supportive wife and the mother of my children, not as his business partner, not as the analytical architect behind every successful venture. I smiled and applauded with everyone else, ignoring the quiet ache beneath my sternum. That same year, Veronica Palmer joined Blackwell Strategic as Harold's executive assistant. I remember meeting her at the company holiday party, striking, intelligent, with an MBA from Columbia and ambition that reminded me of my younger self. I admired her incisive questions about our emerging market strategy and suggested to Harold that she might be valuable on the analytics team. He agreed enthusiastically, mentioning how refreshing her youthful perspective was for the company. I didn't think much of it then. After 45 years of marriage, suspicion wasn't my immediate reaction to anything Harold did. The changes were subtle, at first. Harold began working later, bringing home fewer documents for my review. Weekends became consumed with essential client meetings that couldn't wait until Monday. He purchased a new wardrobe, designer suits that emphasized his still trim physique for a man in his early 70s, a subtly different cologne I hadn't selected. His phone became a jealously guarded possession, always face down, always locked. When I asked about these changes, his explanations were reasonable. Increased competition necessitated longer hours. His position demanded a certain appearance. Security concerns required better phone protocols. I chose to believe him because disbelief seemed unthinkable after half a century together. Besides, I had my own projects consuming my attention. 10 years earlier, I had established the Blackwell Foundation for Financial Literacy, officially a charitable organization focused on educational opportunities for women in finance. Unofficially, it was my private investment vehicle separate from Blackwell Strategic. Each year, I diverted a portion of our profits, with Harold's distracted approval, into this foundation, which then made strategic investments in emerging cryptocurrencies, sustainable energy, and, ironically, competing financial advisory firms. When our 50th anniversary approached, I suggested a vow renewal ceremony, a grand celebration of our enduring partnership, both personal and professional. Harold seemed surprisingly hesitant, but eventually agreed. The ceremony was lavish, covered by financial publications and local media, held in the rooftop garden of our most prestigious office building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wore cream silk, Harold a bespoke tuxedo from his new collection. We renewed promises made half a century earlier, his voice slightly strained as he pledged continued fidelity and partnership. 300 guests applauded as we shared champagne and cut a 5-tiered cake designed to replicate our first office building. Looking back, I realized his eyes never quite met mine throughout the entire celebration. 8 weeks later, on a clear Thursday morning while reviewing quarterly projections in my home office, I received an unexpected call from my old friend Judith Winters, who managed private banking for several prominent families. "Eleanor, darling," she said, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. "I'm calling as your friend, not your banker. Harold was here yesterday moving significant assets to separate accounts. New accounts without your name." My hands remained steady as I opened my laptop. "How significant, Judith?" "Nearly 80 million. He's liquidating positions in the Asian markets and the European bond funds." She paused. "There's more. He inquired about international wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands." I thanked her calmly and hung up, then spent the next several hours methodically accessing every account, every holding, every investment connected to our shared empire. What I discovered wasn't entirely surprising. Harold had begun disentangling his assets from mine nearly 18 months earlier, gradually, carefully, in ways designed not to trigger my attention, preparing for a clean separation. What he failed to realize was that 20 years earlier, I had established my own network of safeguards and separate holdings. While he focused on making bold market moves and cultivating his public image, I had architected our financial framework with multiple redundancies and protective mechanisms. Every partnership agreement, every fund structure, every investment vehicle had subtle clauses and contingencies that could be activated under specific circumstances. Legal tripwires, I called them privately. Invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. I closed my laptop just as I heard Harold's key in the front door. I smoothed my silver hair, applied fresh lipstick, and went downstairs to greet my husband of 50 years. He looked distinguished and uncomfortable in the entryway, his designer luggage arranged neatly by his polished shoes. His face, still handsome at 73, held an expression I'd never seen before. Something between defiance and apology. "Eleanor," he began, voice steady, but hands fidgeting with the watch I'd given him. "I've tried to find the right words, but there aren't any that seem adequate. Our marriage has run its course." I remained silent, observing him like an interesting balance sheet with a significant discrepancy. "I'll always respect what we built together," he continued, seemingly emboldened by my silence. "But the truth is, I need something different at this stage of my life. A different kind of partner, a different kind of energy." "Veronica," I said, not a question. He nodded, relief washing over his features at not having to say it himself. "She understands me creatively. There's a dynamism between us that—" He stopped, perhaps realizing the cruelty in such comparisons. "I've been fair in the division of assets," he continued with the confidence of someone who believes they've thought of everything. "You'll want for nothing, Eleanor. The house, your foundation, sufficient investments to maintain your lifestyle. My lawyers will contact yours tomorrow." I allowed the silence to stretch between us, watching him grow increasingly uncomfortable. 50 years, I finally said, is a significant investment. He flinched slightly at my choice of words. "A comfortable arrangement that has run its course," I repeated his phrase, smiling slightly. "No, Harold, our marriage wasn't the arrangement. Your assumption that I would simply accept your terms, that's the arrangement that has run its course." Confusion flickered across his face. Before he could respond, a car horn sounded from our circular driveway. 2 short beeps, impatient and entitled. "You should go," I said. "Veronica's waiting, and I have calls to make." He hesitated, clearly thrown by my composure. "Eleanor, I hope we can remain civil for the sake of our history, for the children and grandchildren." "I hope your new arrangement brings you everything you truly deserve," I replied, the same pleasant smile still in place. As the door closed behind him, I didn't cry or scream or break the crystal vase he'd brought me from Brussels. Instead, I returned to my office and made 3 calls. First to our family attorney, Lawrence Finch, who had secretly prepared contingency documents at my request years earlier. Second to Amara Okafor, my brilliant protégé at the Blackwell Foundation for Financial Literacy. And third to my daughter Margaret, whose judicial expertise I now required. "Mother," Margaret answered, the time difference evident in her professional tone. "I'm about to enter court. Your father has left me for his 32-year-old assistant," I said without preamble. "I'm activating protocol checkmate." Silence, then shuffling papers. "Are you certain? Once initiated?" "I've never been more certain. Of anything," I interrupted. "How quickly can you clear your docket?" "I'll arrange coverage for my cases and be there by tomorrow evening," she replied, fully engaged now. "Have you called Jonathan and Elizabeth?" "Not yet. Their involvement comes later." I paused. "Margaret, your father believes this will be a simple civilized division after 50 years. My daughter's laugh was low and dangerous. "Then he's forgotten who he married." The next morning, as Harold's lawyer, a brash young man named Carter Phillips called to arrange the terms of our separation. I was already in the downtown office I'd maintained separate from Blackwell Strategic for the past decade. Surrounded by my most trusted advisors, including Lawrence Finch, who had served our family since before the children were born, I laid out my strategy. "Harold believes he secured his most valuable assets," I explained, projecting a complex organizational chart onto the wall screen. "What he doesn't realize is that the majority of Blackwell Strategic's investment vehicles are leveraged through mechanisms that require dual approval for any significant transaction." Lawrence nodded, his ancient fingers tapping the table thoughtfully. "The mutual protection clauses you insisted on in 1995. Brilliant foresight, Eleanor." "Not foresight," I corrected. "Insurance. I never expected to use them, but I believe in sound financial architecture in both investments and legal frameworks." For the next 3 hours, we meticulously reviewed each holding in the Blackwell portfolio, identifying vulnerabilities and opportunities. By noon, we had developed a comprehensive strategy that would unfold over the coming months. I was not interested in a quick, vindictive strike. Those were for amateurs and the emotionally undisciplined. What I envisioned required patience, precision, and the careful application of pressure at exactly the right points, the same principles that had guided my financial analysis for 5 decades. "Mrs. Blackwell," Carter Phillips's voice sounded overly confident when he finally reached me that afternoon. "I'm calling to discuss the terms of your separation. Mr. Blackwell has been incredibly generous in his proposed settlement." "Mr. Phillips," I replied pleasantly, "please inform your client that I will not be accepting any settlement proposals at this time. My team will be conducting a comprehensive audit of all Blackwell strategic assets before any discussions can proceed." His confidence wavered. "That's really not necessary. We've prepared a complete accounting." "I'm sure you have," I interrupted. "However, given the circumstances, I prefer my own accounting. Lawrence Finch will be contacting you regarding access to all relevant documents. Mrs. Blackwell." His voice sharpened. "Dragging this out won't benefit anyone. Mr. Blackwell is prepared to be generous, but his patience isn't unlimited." I allowed myself a small smile. "After 50 years of marriage, Mr. Phillips, I understand my husband's patience quite intimately. Please pass along my message. Good day." That evening, Margaret arrived, impeccably dressed despite 20 hours in transit, her judge's analytical mind already focused on the task at hand. My daughter had grown into a formidable woman, brilliant, strategic, with an ethical compass that pointed true but recognized the complexities of justice. "I've reviewed everything you sent," she said, accepting the glass of whiskey I offered. "Father has been planning this for at least 2 years. The Cayman accounts, the restructured holdings in Tokyo and Frankfurt, the gradual transfer of algorithmic proprietary rights to subsidiary companies. It's comprehensive but flawed," I noted. He focused on the assets he values, the high-profile funds, the trophy investments, the public-facing elements of our empire. He overlooked the infrastructure. Margaret smiled, so like me in that moment. The foundation beneath the skyscraper. Exactly. I activated my secure tablet, displaying a different organizational chart from the one I'd shown my legal team. "This is the actual structure of Blackwell Holdings. Your father is aware of perhaps 65% of it. The rest is secured through the foundation, through Jonathan's medical research trust, through Elizabeth's diplomatic immunity provisions, and through a dozen other entities that appear unrelated to our family." My daughter studied the chart, her expression shifting from surprise to admiration. "Mother, this is extraordinarily complex. You've created a financial fortress." "I prefer to think of it as a chessboard," I replied. "Beautiful, structured, with clear strategies if you know how to see 8 moves ahead. Your father never bothered to learn beyond the opening gambit. He trusted me to manage the middle game while he prepared for what he thought would be a simple endgame." Margaret looked up from the tablet. "What exactly are you planning?" "I'm not destroying your father, Margaret. I'm simply reclaiming what's rightfully mine. The entire portfolio we built together. Every fund, every investment, every dollar and the cent. And I'm going to do it legally, methodically, and so elegantly that he won't realize what's happening until checkmate is inevitable." My daughter studied me with new eyes, not just as her mother, but as a strategist whose complexity she hadn't fully appreciated until now. "Why not just fight for half in the divorce? That would be simpler, cleaner." "Because half isn't accurate," I said firmly. "Your father made bold market moves, yes, but I designed the algorithms, structured the risk profiles, managed the downside protections, and created the analytical framework that made each investment successful. For 50 years, I was content to stand in his shadow, to be introduced as Harold's wife, while I quietly built the foundation of everything he claimed credit for." I set down my glass. "I'm not seeking revenge, Margaret. I'm seeking recognition, and I'll obtain it by owning every investment in his portfolio." The morning after Harold's departure dawned with unusual clarity. After 5 decades of marriage, I expected to feel some form of disorientation in his absence, but instead found myself experiencing a peculiar sense of focus. The house, our house, felt different, as though the air had been recalibrated to support just one person instead of 2. I dressed with particular care that morning, selecting a tailored charcoal suit I'd purchased in Milan 3 years earlier. Armor, my eldest granddaughter Olivia had called it when she'd joined me for that shopping trip. At 23, she had already developed an astute understanding of power dynamics. "Not because you need protection, Grandma," she'd explained, "but because sometimes it helps to wear your strength on the outside." Margaret arrived at 9, having spent the night in her old room. Her usual courtroom confidence was tempered with a daughter's concern as she joined me for breakfast on the terrace. "How did you sleep?" she asked, watching me carefully over her coffee cup. "Better than I have in months," I replied truthfully. "There's a certain peace and clarity." She nodded, understanding immediately. Margaret had always been the most like me, analytical, patient, with a gift for seeing the complex machinery beneath seemingly simple situations. "Carter Phillips has already left 3 messages," she said, checking her phone. "Father's legal team isn't accustomed to being stonewalled. They'll need to develop new capabilities then," I replied, spreading a precise amount of marmalade on my toast. Lawrence has initiated the comprehensive audit procedure. Every account, every holding, every investment vehicle connected to Blackwell. Strategic is now subject to review before any asset division can be discussed. That will buy us 3 weeks at minimum, Margaret noted. More if they resist document production, which they will. And by then, Jonathan and Elizabeth will be here, I added. My son's medical expertise and my younger daughter's diplomatics connections would both prove valuable as our strategy unfolded. In the meantime, we moved to Phase 1. Phase 1 began that afternoon when Lawrence Finch filed formal requests for financial disclosure with every institution connected to Blackwell. Strategic. Simultaneously, Amara Okafor initiated a series of discreet inquiries through my foundation's international network regarding Harold's newly established Cayman accounts. The first substantive response came from Harold himself, not his attorneys. 3 days later, a blistering phone call filled with uncharacteristic profanity. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Eleanor?" he demanded, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Credit Suisse has frozen access to the Frankfurt portfolio, pending governance review. Morgan Stanley is requesting additional documentation on the Pacific Rim Fund transfer. The Singapore Sovereign Wealth Compliance team is asking questions I can't answer." "How interesting," I replied calmly. "It seems the financial architecture is more intricate than you remembered." "This is petty and beneath you," he snapped. "If you want to discuss an equitable division, have your lawyers contact mine. These obstructionist tactics won't change the outcome." "Nothing about protecting my interests is beneath me, Harold. I learned that from you." I kept my tone pleasant. "By the way, how are the Caymans this time of year? Is Veronica enjoying the beaches?" His sharp intake of breath told me everything. "How did you—" 50 years, Harold," I interrupted softly. "Did you really think I wouldn't have friends throughout the global financial system? Enjoy your vacation. We'll continue this discussion when you return." The call ended abruptly, and I immediately contacted Margaret. "Your father has discovered the first tripwires. The defensive measures are working as designed." "How did he sound?" she asked. "Surprised," I replied. "And that's precisely where we need him. Off balance and uncertain." Jonathan arrived the following day from Rochester, his surgeon's precision evident in how quickly he assessed the situation. After reviewing the documents Margaret and I had prepared, he offered his own specialized contribution. 3 of Blackwell Strategic's most lucrative biotechnology investment funds had been structured with unprecedented access to clinical trial data, access that came through research partnerships Jonathan had helped establish through his position at Mayo Clinic. "Father never fully understood the terms of those research agreements," Jonathan explained as we sat in my home office. "The data access provisions require ongoing verification through qualified medical personnel, specifically, through the original medical advisor who established the protocols, which is you," Margaret said, immediately grasping the implication. Jonathan nodded. "I can initiate a compliance review that would temporarily restrict access to the predictive analytics driving those funds' performance. Not indefinitely, but long enough to create significant uncertainty for investors." "Do it," I decided, not to damage the funds themselves, but to demonstrate the fragility of Harold's independent control. Elizabeth arrived from Singapore 2 days later, bringing with her expertise in international diplomatic finance that would prove invaluable. Within hours of her arrival, she had identified 7 jurisdictional vulnerabilities in Harold's offshore structure, regulatory inconsistencies that could trigger automatic compliance reviews if properly flagged. "The Cayman accounts are just the beginning," she explained, projecting a global map highlighted with financial pathways. "He's established a classic cascade structure with endpoints in Singapore, Luxembourg, and oddly, Mauritius. It's sophisticated, but conventional. The same framework used by dozens of hedge funds trying to minimize regulatory exposure. And therefore predictable," I noted. "Exactly," Elizabeth confirmed. Every node in the cascade has standard fail-safes that can be activated by the right regulatory inquiry. He's followed the standard playbook without accounting for how financial regulation has evolved in response to exactly these structures. With my 3 children assembled, each bringing their specialized expertise to complement my own, we finalized the comprehensive strategy I had begun developing the moment Harold walked out the door. This wasn't merely about asset division. It was about fundamental recognition of contributions, about correcting decades of imbalance, about reclaiming what should rightfully be acknowledged. The critical element, I explained as we reviewed, the complete organizational schema, is maintaining perfect legitimacy in every action. We're not engaging in financial warfare. We're simply exercising proper governance and oversight protections that have always existed within our corporate structure, protections your father happily ignored when they suited his purposes. The notification from Lawrence came the following morning. Carter Phillips had filed an emergency motion seeking to circumvent the comprehensive audit process, claiming unnecessary delays causing potential irreparable harm to time-sensitive investment operations. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. They're getting desperate sooner than we anticipated, Margaret observed. Father must have commitments he can't fulfill while the main accounts remain restricted. Good, I replied. Pressure reveals structural weaknesses. Now we accelerate Phase 2. Phase 2 was considerably more aggressive than our initial defensive measures. Jonathan initiated the medical compliance review of the biotech funds, immediately restricting access to the predictive analytics that gave those investments their competitive edge. Elizabeth activated her diplomatic channels to raise discreet, regulatory flags regarding the offshore cascade structure. And most crucial, Amara Okafor began approaching key institutional investors in Blackwell Strategic's flagship funds with troubling questions about governance and accountability. These weren't random strikes, but precisely calculated pressure points designed to demonstrate a fundamental truth. Harold might have been the public face of Blackwell Strategic for 5 decades, but I had always been its essential architecture. The response came not from Harold or his attorneys, but from an unexpected source. Veronica Palmer herself appeared at my door on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, looking considerably less confident than she had during our company holiday interactions. Mrs. Blackwell, she began, smoothing her designer dress nervously. I felt we should talk, woman to woman. I invited her into the foyer, but no further, a deliberate choice that didn't escape her notice. I offered no refreshments, no comfortable seat, only my measured attention. I want you to know that I never intended to come between. She stopped at my raised eyebrow. What I mean is, Harold and I, our connection is genuine. It wasn't about his wealth or position. Ms. Palmer, I said gently, I'm 68 years old. I've been married for 50 years and built a multi-billion-dollar financial enterprise from nothing. Please don't insult my intelligence with platitudes about genuine connections. She flushed, fingers twisting the expensive watch on her wrist, a gift from Harold, undoubtedly. I'm trying to be respectful, she said, her voice smaller now. Respectful would have been declining my husband's advances. Respectful would have been resigning your position once your relationship became inappropriate. Respectful would have been waiting until our divorce was finalized before accompanying him to the Caymans. I allowed a small smile. But we're beyond respect now, aren't we? So why are you really here, Veronica? Her composure cracked slightly. The European Monetary Authority has initiated a special audit of the Frankfurt portfolio. 3 institutional investors in the Pacific Rim Fund have suspended their capital commitments. The Sovereign Wealth Compliance Inquiry has expanded to include personal financial disclosures. And there it was, the real reason for her visit. Not woman-to-woman understanding, but panic over the unraveling of Harold's carefully constructed separation plan? How unfortunate, I replied. Financial structures can be so complex, can't they? One small irregularity can affect the entire system. He thinks you're behind it. Her eyes narrowed. Are you? I stood, indicating our conversation was concluding. Veronica, you chose to participate in the dismantling of my marriage. You are not entitled to explanations about my financial decisions. Please tell Harold that if he has concerns about Blackwell Strategic's regulatory compliance, he should address them through proper channels, not send his girlfriend as an emissary. After she left, I called my children together. Phase 2 has achieved its purpose. Harold now understands that his independent control is illusory. Initiate Phase 3. Phase 3 was our most consequential move, the activation of the dormant cross-collateralization provisions embedded in Blackwell Strategic's primary fund structures. These provisions, which I had insisted upon during our major expansion 15 years earlier, required that any attempt to separate component funds from the central management structure would trigger automatic collateral reviews across the entire portfolio. In practical terms, this meant that Harold's attempts to extract his personal investment vehicles from the larger Blackwell framework had inadvertently triggered governance protocols requiring comprehensive disclosure of all related entities, including his carefully concealed Cayman structures. By the time the emergency hearing arrived, Harold had returned from the Caribbean, his island tan contrasting sharply with his thunderous expression as he entered the conference room at Lawrence Finch's law firm. Carter Phillips flanked him on one side, 2 additional attorneys I didn't recognize on the other. Specialists brought in for what Harold clearly anticipated would be a decisive confrontation. I sat across the table, flanked by Lawrence, Margaret, Jonathan, and Elizabeth, a family united not just by blood but by strategic purpose. Harold's eyes widened slightly at seeing all 3 of our children present, perhaps only now realizing the generational implications of his actions. "This has gone far enough, Eleanor," he began without preamble. "The Frankfurt portfolio is on hold. The Pacific Rim Fund is hemorrhaging investor confidence. The biotech vehicles can't access their predictive analytics. You're damaging everything we built together out of what? Spite? Revenge?" I regarded him calmly from across the polished mahogany. "I'm not damaging anything, Harold. I'm simply ensuring proper governance and regulatory compliance, principles you've always claimed to value. By freezing essential operations? By triggering unnecessary compliance reviews? By undermining investor confidence?" His voice rose with each question. "This isn't like you, Eleanor. You've always been the prudent one, the risk manager." "Perhaps you never really knew me," I suggested quietly. "Perhaps while you were accepting accolades and appearing on financial magazine covers, I was building something you never bothered to understand." He stared at me, genuine puzzlement crossing his features. For a moment, I glimpsed the young MBA candidate who had looked at me with wonder when I solved complex equations that had stymied him. A flash of recognition that something substantial existed beyond his comprehension. The moment passed quickly as Carter Phillips cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blackwell, this meeting was arranged to discuss the removal of obstructionist measures and proceed with an equitable asset division. Mr. Blackwell has prepared a revised settlement offer that is extraordinarily generous given the circumstances." Lawrence Finch smiled slightly. "Before we discuss any settlement, we'll need completed documentation on all Blackwell Strategic holdings, including the recently established entities in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Singapore, and Mauritius." Harold's head snapped toward Lawrence, then back to me, his expression darkening. "This is about money? Fine. Name your price, Eleanor. Half the liquid assets? The house? The foundation fully endowed? Just stop whatever you're doing to the operational infrastructure." "This isn't about money, Harold," I replied evenly. "This is about recognition. This is about acknowledgement that without my financial architecture, your market instincts would have resulted in bankruptcy during at least 3 major downturns. This is about correcting the record after 50 years of partnership." I slid a document across the table, not the settlement agreement they expected, but something far more consequential. "These are my terms. Review them with your lawyers, but understand they're non-negotiable. Harold scanned the first page, his face paling. You're asking for controlling interest in everything. The entire portfolio, the management, company, even the algorithmic proprietary rights. Not asking, Harold. Claiming what's rightfully mine. This is insane, he whispered, looking to his attorneys for support. She's trying to appropriate the entire Blackwell enterprise. I'm not appropriating anything, I corrected. I'm preserving it under proper management. You chose to leave our partnership, personal and professional. These are the consequences of that choice. Harold left with the document, ashen-faced but still believing he had leverage, options, alternatives. What he failed to understand was that while he had been planning his exit for 2 years, I had been preparing for contingencies like this for 2 decades. The chess pieces had been arranged long before he made his first move, the endgame calculated, before he even considered leaving the board. As we watched them depart, Margaret turned to me with newfound respect in her eyes. He still doesn't fully understand what's happening, does he? No, I replied, gathering my papers. But he will. The fallout from our initial confrontation was swift and multifaceted. Within 48 hours, Harold had assembled what the financial press would later call his war cabinet, an impressive collection of legal specialists, financial strategists, and corporate governance experts housed in the top floor of the Blackwell Tower. Through discreet channels, I learned they were working around the clock, searching for vulnerabilities in my position, weaknesses in my strategy, escape routes from the closing trap. What amused me was how they approached the problem, like traditional financial tacticians facing a conventional adversary. They were looking for legal loopholes, regulatory workarounds, jurisdictional advantages. They failed to understand that I wasn't playing the same game they were. I had designed the board itself. They've retained Summerfield and Rowe, Lawrence informed me over a working lunch in my study. The silver-haired attorney's expression remained impassive, but I detected a note of respect in his voice. Summerfield was the premier financial litigation firm on the East Coast. Bringing them in signaled that Harold recognized the existential threat to his position. And they've filed motions in 3 jurisdictions, Margaret added, reviewing updates on her tablet. New York, Frankfurt, and Singapore, attempting to compartmentalize the legal battles and prevent unified governance review. A standard segmentation strategy, I noted, unsurprised. Harold always preferred dealing with complex problems by breaking them into manageable pieces. There's more, Elizabeth interjected, looking up from her phone. My contacts at the Monetary Authority of Singapore report that he's attempting to restructure the Pacific Rim holdings under a new entity, Blackwell Global Partners, with himself as sole managing director. I smiled slightly. Attempting to rebrand while maintaining control. Predictable, but ineffective given the underlying structural dependencies. He's also reaching out to our largest institutional investors, Jonathan reported, offering private meetings with assurances of stability and enhanced returns. 3 have accepted so far: Vanderbilt Endowment, Ontario Teachers' Pension, and First Emirates Sovereign. This represented Harold's most serious countermove, an attempt to shore up investor confidence independently of the legal proceedings. If successful, it would give him leverage in potential settlement negotiations. Perfect, I said, surprising my children. That's exactly where we want him, personally reassuring investors about outcomes he can no longer guarantee. Margaret studied me with newfound appreciation. You're setting him up for a trust violation. I nodded. Financial markets can forgive many things, but not failed promises to institutional investors. When those promised outcomes don't materialize, the reputational damage will be irreversible. The true elegance of my strategy was its fundamental simplicity. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver Harold in a complex legal battle. I was simply allowing the consequences of his own actions to manifest through the financial architecture I had designed. Like a grandmaster who sees 20 moves ahead, I had constructed a position where each defensive move he made would only accelerate his eventual defeat. That evening, while my children coordinated our next tactical responses, I retreated to the garden Harold and I had designed together 15 years earlier. The Japanese maples were just beginning to turn their autumn crimson, the carefully placed stone lanterns casting long shadows across the koi pond. Here, in this peaceful space, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection on what had been lost. Not just a marriage, but a partnership that had spanned 2/3 of my life. A soft footfall on the stone path announced my eldest granddaughter's presence before she spoke. "Grandma?" Olivia's voice was gentle as she approached, 2 cups of tea in hand. "Mom said you might be out here." I accepted the offered cup with genuine gratitude. At 23, Olivia had Margaret's incisive mind but a warmer temperament, a perfect combination for the corporate psychologist she was training to become. "How are you really doing?" she asked, settling beside me on the bench. "Not the strategic mastermind everyone's seeing, but you, the person behind it all?" The question caught me off guard. In the whirlwind of legal maneuvers and financial countermeasures, few had asked about my emotional state. Even my children had focused primarily on the tactical challenges, perhaps assuming that their methodical mother had compartmentalized her feelings as efficiently as she had organized their father's financial demise. I paused, considering honestly. I'm surprised by how little I feel about Harold himself. The betrayal, yes, that stings in ways I hadn't anticipated. But the man? It's as though I'm seeing him clearly for the first time in decades, and recognizing how little of substance remains beyond the carefully constructed facade. Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "You're grieving the idea more than the reality." "Precisely." I sipped my tea, appreciating her insight. 50 years is a considerable investment in any relationship. Coming to terms with its fundamental imbalance requires a certain recalibration of memory itself. "Is that why you're taking everything? Not just half?" she asked, direct but without judgment. "As compensation for the imbalance?" I considered. My brilliant granddaughter, recognizing that her generation viewed gender dynamics and professional recognition through a different lens than mine. For them, equal partnership wasn't a revolutionary concept, but an expected baseline. "I'm taking everything because that's the accurate reflection of contribution," I explained. "Your grandfather built his reputation on financial structures I designed, risk models I created, algorithms I perfected. The world saw him as the visionary while I remained the invisible foundation. This isn't about compensation. It's about correction." Olivia's expression shifted to one of understanding. "You're not just reclaiming assets. You're reclaiming narrative." Her perception was startling in its clarity. "Yes," I acknowledged. "And that's ultimately more valuable than any portfolio, regardless of its size." Our conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Amara. "Mrs. Blackwell, we've detected unusual activity in the Frankfurt portfolio. Someone's attempting to override the compliance holds using emergency management protocols." I thanked her for the alert and turned to Olivia. "Duty calls. Your grandfather is making his move earlier than anticipated." Within the hour, my crisis team had assembled. In my home office, the attempted override of the Frankfurt portfolio controls represented a significant escalation, a direct challenge to the governance framework I had established. "He's invoked the catastrophic market event provisions," Elizabeth explained, reviewing the emergency protocols, claiming that the compliance holds constitute an artificial market constraint that could trigger systemic risk. "It's clever," Lawrence admitted. "Those provisions were designed to allow management flexibility during genuine market crises. Using them as a weapon in a governance dispute is creative and potentially effective," Margaret added. "The German regulatory authorities take systemic risk claims seriously, particularly given Frankfurt's position in the European financial system." I considered our options carefully. Harold's move was indeed more sophisticated than I had anticipated. He was leveraging regulatory concern about market stability against my governance controls. A direct counter would appear obstructionist, potentially damaging the very portfolio I was attempting to secure. We don't fight this directly, I decided. Instead, we agree with his concern while changing the parameters. My team looked at me questioningly. Inform the German authorities that we share the concern about systemic risk and are implementing immediate stabilization measures, specifically transferring operational control of the Frankfurt portfolio to the Blackwell Foundation for Financial Literacy, which has maintained parallel risk management architecture for the past decade specifically for such contingencies. Jonathan grasped the strategy immediately. Brilliant. You're not opposing his emergency motion. You're supporting it while redirecting control to your separate entity. Exactly, I confirmed. The Foundation has legitimate standing as a risk management partner, given its long historical involvement with Blackwell Strategic's compliance frameworks. This isn't obstruction, it's responsible governance in action. The German authorities approved our stabilization plan within hours, effectively transferring control of the Frankfurt portfolio, approximately $3.2 billion in assets, from Harold's direct management to my foundation's oversight. His attempt to circumvent my controls had instead accelerated the transfer of power I had been orchestrating more gradually. Harold's response came not through legal channels, but in a direct, furious phone call at nearly midnight. What the hell? Have you done? He demanded, his voice hoarse with rage and exhaustion. The German regulators have handed Frankfurt to your foundation based on historical risk management protocols I've never even heard of. Those protocols have been in place for 12 years, Harold, I replied calmly. They're referenced in every annual compliance report since 2011. Reports you signed but clearly never read. The Foundation has always maintained parallel risk architecture as a contingency measure. I'm simply activating systems that have always existed. This is theft on an unprecedented scale, he hissed. You won't get away with this. It's not theft. Harold, it's proper governance. A concept you might have familiarized yourself with before attempting to dismantle a financial structure built on intricate interdependencies and carefully designed fail-safes. After he hung up, I notified my team of this latest development. He's beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation, but still believes this is simply about asset division. He hasn't yet grasped that the entire management framework was designed with multiple redundancies and control points, all of which are now being activated against him. The following morning brought news that sent ripples through the financial community. The Wall Street Journal's front page carried the headline, Blackwell Foundation assumes control of Frankfurt portfolio amid governance concerns. The article detailed the German regulatory decision, noting that sources familiar with the situation describe significant compliance questions surrounding recent management decisions at Blackwell Strategic Investments. This public acknowledgement of governance issues represented a pivotal shift in our campaign. What had begun as a private dispute was now subject to market scrutiny, regulatory oversight, and media attention. Harold's personal reputation, the charismatic, financial visionary, was now directly linked to troubling questions about corporate governance. The article prompted immediate reactions from our other institutional investors. By mid-afternoon, representatives from 6 major pension funds, 3 sovereign wealth managers, and 2 university endowments had requested emergency briefings on the situation. They weren't merely concerned about their investments. They were worried about potential regulatory contagion and reputational association. This was precisely the pressure point I had anticipated. Institutional investors are uniquely sensitive to governance concerns. Their fiduciary responsibilities and reporting requirements make them inherently risk-averse when it comes to management irregularities. The moment those investors began questioning Blackwell Strategic's governance, Harold's position became untenable. Lawrence arrived at my home with uncharacteristic urgency, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. Carter Phillips has requested an immediate meeting, no preconditions, no agenda limitations. They're asking for the earliest possible time you can accommodate. Tomorrow morning, I decided. Let them spend another night contemplating their deteriorating position. That evening, I gathered my children for what I expected would be our final strategic council before the endgame. Each had performed their role with remarkable precision. Margaret leveraging her judicial connections to anticipate legal countermoves, Jonathan utilizing his medical network to secure the biotech investments, and Elizabeth deploying her diplomatic channels to navigate international regulatory frameworks. Harold will attempt a final negotiation tomorrow, I explained. He'll offer substantial concessions, likely control of specific investment vehicles, management roles for each of you, perhaps even public acknowledgement of my contributions. He'll present it as a reasonable compromise that prevents further market disruption. And your response? Elizabeth asked. Will depend entirely on whether he finally understands what this was never about. I smiled slightly. We'll see if 50 years of marriage has taught him anything about who he's actually facing. As my children departed for the evening, I returned to my study and opened the small cherrywood box that had sat on my desk for decades. Inside was the jade ring Harold had given me when we became engaged, a simple band that had preceded the more elaborate diamond he'd replaced it with on our 5th anniversary. I had kept this original ring as a reminder of our beginning, of two young people with complementary talents believing they could build something extraordinary together. In many ways, we had succeeded beyond our most ambitious dreams. Blackwell. Strategic had transformed the financial landscape, pioneered investment approaches that others imitated but never quite matched, created wealth and opportunity across continents. The tragedy wasn't that our marriage had ended. It was that Harold had never truly recognized that our success had always been genuinely collaborative, fundamentally interdependent. Tomorrow would determine whether that recognition came too late to matter. The Blackwell Towers executive conference room had witnessed countless pivotal negotiations over the decades: merger agreements, sovereign fund allocations, restructuring plans during the financial crisis. Its walls of burnished mahogany had absorbed the tension of billion-dollar decisions, the quiet satisfaction of successful strategies, the occasional desperation of failing positions. Today, it would witness something unprecedented. Its founder, facing complete removal from the enterprise that bore his name. I chose the location deliberately. Harold had suggested meeting at Lawrence's offices, neutral territory that would emphasize the legal nature of our discussion. I countered with Blackwell Tower, a psychological reminder that the company headquarters itself was contested ground. I arrived 15 minutes early, accompanied by Lawrence, Margaret, and Amara. We were already seated at the massive conference table when Harold entered with Carter Phillips and two senior partners from Summerfield and Rowe. His appearance startled me momentarily. In the 2 weeks since our confrontation, he seemed to have aged years. The impeccable tailoring of his suit couldn't disguise the weight loss, the pronounced shadows beneath his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he placed his portfolio on the table. Veronica was conspicuously absent. Harold nodded curtly toward our group but addressed me directly. Eleanor. His voice was steadier than his appearance suggested. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, I replied, maintaining professional composure. I believe we have substantive matters to discuss. Carter Phillips opened with a conciliatory tone that contrasted sharply with his previous aggressive stance. Mrs. Blackwell, recent developments have created unnecessary market uncertainty and potential reputational risk for all parties. We believe a structured resolution is in everyone's interest, Lawrence responded with practiced neutrality. We're certainly open to resolution that appropriately recognizes Mrs. Blackwell's position and contributions. The senior Summerfield partner, a silver-haired woman I recognized as Victoria Summerfield herself, spoke next. To that end, we've prepared a comprehensive settlement framework that addresses governance concerns while preserving operational continuity. She distributed bound presentations, the Summerfield embossed logo gleaming on expensive paper. The document was impressively thorough, a complete restructuring proposal that would divide Blackwell Strategic's vast holdings into distinct entities with separate governance structures. Under their proposal, I would receive controlling interest in the Frankfurt portfolio, which I already controlled, the Sustainable Investment Division, and the Algorithmic Trading subsidiary. Harold would retain the flagship American funds, the Pacific Rim Investments, and majority interest in the management company itself. My children would receive expanded roles within this new structure, with significant equity allocations and board positions. On paper, it appeared equitable, approximately 48% of the assets under my direct control, with additional influence through my children's positions. The financial press would undoubtedly describe it as a generous settlement that acknowledged my contributions while maintaining Harold's leadership of the core enterprise. I closed the presentation after reviewing just 3 pages. "This is unacceptable." Harold's carefully maintained composure slipped. "For God's sake, Eleanor, it's nearly half the entire portfolio with guaranteed board positions for the children. What more could you possibly want?" "Recognition," I replied simply. "Not of what you believe you can spare, but of what is factually mine to claim." "We've spent 2 weeks drafting this proposal," Carter Phillips interjected, clearly unsettled. "It represents unprecedented accommodation of your position." "It represents continued misunderstanding of my position," I corrected. "This isn't a negotiation about asset division. This is a transition of control to the rightful architect of Blackwell Strategic success." Victoria Summerfield studied me with newfound interest. "Mrs. Blackwell, while your contributions have clearly been substantial, Mr. Blackwell has been the recognized market visionary and strategic leader for 5 decades. The proposal acknowledges your behind-the-scenes role while preserving essential continuity." "Behind the scenes," I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air. "An interesting characterization of the person who designed the risk management framework that saved this company during 3 market collapses, who created the algorithmic trading models that generate 43% of annual revenues, who structured the compliance architecture that allowed expansion into 15 regulatory jurisdictions." I reached for my own portfolio, extracting a single document rather than the elaborate presentations they had prepared. "This is my counter-proposal. It's non-negotiable." Lawrence distributed copies to the opposing team, a simple 3-page document outlining complete transfer of control to me, with Harold retaining his personal assets and a lifetime advisory position should he choose to accept it. The room fell, silent as they reviewed the terms. Harold's face flushed crimson. "This is absurd. You're demanding everything, the entire enterprise." "Not demanding, Harold. Claiming what I built. What we built," he corrected, voice rising. 50 years of partnership, Eleanor. I was there for every decision, every expansion, every critical juncture. "Yes, you were," I acknowledged calmly. "Standing in the spotlight, accepting the accolades, building your personal mythology while I constructed the actual enterprise. You were the frontman for a band that never knew who was composing the music." "Victoria," Summerfield interjected with the practiced neutrality of a professional negotiator. "Perhaps there's middle ground between these positions that—" "There isn't," I interrupted politely but firmly. "The existing governance structure is already implementing my framework. The Frankfurt portfolio is under foundation control. The Algorithmic Trading Division reports to Amara. The compliance reviews have expanded to the American funds and will reach the Pacific Rim Investments by next week. This meeting isn't about negotiating control. It's about whether the transition happens with Mr. Blackwell's cooperation or despite his resistance." Carter Phillips turned to Harold with evident concern. "Is this accurate? Has operational control already shifted to this extent?" Harold's silence was confirmation enough. I continued. The institutional investors are already aware of the governance transition. 3 have expressed explicit support for the new structure given their long-standing relationships with my risk management team. 2 more have indicated they will follow the German regulatory endorsement, which is already in place. The reality of Harold's position was finally becoming clear to his legal team. This wasn't a negotiation between equal parties. It was a briefing on a transition already substantially complete. If you persist in fighting this inevitable outcome, I added, the continued market disruption will damage the very assets you're attempting to retain. Your reputation, however, will suffer the most significant depreciation. Harold stared at me across the table. The man I had spent 50 years beside, now seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time. In his expression, I recognized a complex mixture of emotions, anger, certainly, but also disbelief, wounded pride, and something else that might have been dawning respect. You planned this for years, he said, not a question, but a realization. The foundation, the parallel risk structures, the redundant compliance frameworks. This wasn't a response to my leaving. You built this architecture long before Veronica ever entered the picture. I built safeguards, I corrected. Insurance against contingencies I hoped would never materialize. The financial world is unpredictable. Harold? I've always understood that better than you. Where is Veronica, by the way? Margaret asked, breaking her professional silence for the first personal question of the meeting. Harold's mouth tightened. She's reconsidering her position, given recent developments. Translation: she was already gone, having recognized that the wealthy financial titan she'd attached herself to was rapidly becoming neither wealthy nor titanic. Victoria Summerfield, ever the pragmatist, redirected the conversation. Given the operational realities Mrs. Blackwell has outlined, we should discuss how to minimize disruption while formalizing the transition. A structured handover with appropriate public messaging would benefit all parties. Carter Phillips nodded reluctantly, recognizing the inevitable. A joint statement emphasizing continuity and orderly succession would preserve client confidence and market stability. Harold looked between his attorneys with growing comprehension that they were already negotiating surrender terms. His eyes returned to me, narrowed with a final desperate attempt to understand. Why everything, Eleanor? After 50 years, why not a genuine partnership divided equally? Why this total victory? The question deserved an honest answer, not for the benefit of his lawyers or mine, but as the conclusion to 5 decades of shared history. Because equality was always available to you, Harold, I said quietly. For 50 years, you could have acknowledged me as your equal partner, recognized my contributions publicly, shared the spotlight you so cherished. Instead, you built a narrative that erased me from our success story, relegated me to supportive wife, while claiming sole visionary status. I gathered my papers preparing to conclude the meeting. This isn't about victory, Harold. It's about correction. The world will finally understand who really built Blackwell Strategic Investments. Your narrative ends. The truth begins. Harold's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of recognition finally settling upon them. And if I sign your proposal? What then? Then you retain your dignity, your public reputation, and an advisory role that honors your contributions while acknowledging the actual balance of our partnership. I stood, signaling the meeting's end. The choice is yours, but I recommend deciding quickly. Markets abhor uncertainty, and the Nikkei opens in 3 hours. As I walked out with my team, I heard Victoria Summerfield speaking quietly to Harold. Sign it. You've already lost control. All that remains is determining how history will remember you. In the elevator descending from the executive floor, Lawrence turned to me with quiet admiration. In 45 years of practice, I've never seen a more comprehensive strategic triumph. He never saw it coming. No, I agreed. He never did. That was always his fundamental weakness. He couldn't imagine being outmaneuvered by someone he never truly saw as his equal. Margaret squeezed my hand gently. "History corrected," she said, echoing my own words back to me. As we stepped into the marble lobby of Blackwell Tower, soon to be renamed, I allowed myself a moment to absorb the significance of what had transpired. This wasn't merely a legal victory or financial acquisition. It was the reclamation of my rightful place as the true architect of a financial empire, the correction of a historical record that had minimized my existence for half a century. Harold's signature arrived on my proposal 3 hours later. The transition of power became official on a crisp autumn morning when the newly formed board of directors convened for its inaugural meeting. The boardroom, recently renovated with warm cherry wood and soft lighting that replaced Harold's preferred stark modernism, reflected the subtle but significant changes spreading throughout the organization. I sat at the head of the table, a position I had never occupied during Harold's 5-decade reign. To my right was Margaret, now Chief Compliance Officer. To my left, Amara Okafor as Chief Investment Strategist. The remaining seats were filled with a carefully selected blend of longtime Blackwell executives who had quietly supported my vision, and fresh voices bringing diverse perspectives to our leadership. "Welcome to the first official meeting of Blackwell Strategic Partners," I began, using the enterprise's new name, similar enough to maintain market recognition but distinct enough to signal transformation. Today marks not just a change in leadership, but an evolution in philosophy. The announcement released to the financial press that morning had been crafted with precise messaging. Eleanor Blackwell, co-founder and chief architect of the firm's proprietary risk management systems, assumes full leadership following Harold Blackwell's decision to step back from active management. The transition formalizes Mrs. Blackwell's long-standing role as the strategic cornerstone of the organization's success. The carefully worded statement allowed Harold to save face while establishing my rightful position in the company narrative. It was diplomatic, but unequivocal. The financial world would now recognize who had truly built this empire. The market's response exceeded even our optimistic projections. By closing bell, our flagship funds had seen institutional inflows of over $600 million, a resounding vote of confidence from investors who had always known, if only privately, that my risk architecture had been the true foundation of Blackwell's remarkable performance. 3 prominent financial publications requested exclusive interviews, and the prestigious Global Finance Review announced they were featuring me in their Hidden Architects cover story, a series highlighting women whose unacknowledged contributions had shaped major financial institutions. As the board meeting progressed through its agenda, I found myself observing the executives around the table with newfound perspective. How many other women in this industry, I wondered, were silently creating value while men claimed credit? How many brilliant minds remained in the shadows, their contributions systematically minimized? The thought sparked an idea that would become a cornerstone of my leadership vision. When we reached the final agenda item, strategic initiatives, I unveiled a proposal that clearly surprised several board members. "I'm establishing the Blackwell Visibility Initiative," I announced, a comprehensive program to identify and promote overlooked talent within our organization, with particular emphasis on those whose contributions have been systemically undervalued due to gender, race, or background. The initiative would include mentorship programs, revised attribution practices for investment strategies, and transparent performance metrics that acknowledged all contributors to successful outcomes. Most revolutionary was the compensation structure. Bonuses would now be allocated based on documented contribution rather than position or seniority. For too long, this industry has operated on perception rather than reality, rewarding those who claim credit rather than those who create value, I explained. Blackwell Strategic Partners will establish a new paradigm where recognition aligns with actual contribution. Margaret's expression conveyed quiet pride, while Amara nodded with enthusiastic approval. The older executives showed more reservation. This represented a significant departure from traditional Wall Street practices, but none voiced opposition. The board unanimously approved the initiative, setting in motion a transformation that would eventually become an industry benchmark. After the meeting, I returned to what had previously been Harold's corner office, now undergoing its own transformation. The imposing mahogany desk had been replaced with a more collaborative workspace. The wall of framed magazine covers featuring Harold had been removed, soon to be replaced with artistic representations of mathematical principles and market abstractions. As I settled into my new space, my assistant announced an unexpected visitor, my oldest grandson, Michael, Jonathan's 19-year-old son who was studying economics at Princeton. "Grandma," he greeted me with a warm hug. "Dad told me you were staging a revolution. I wanted to see it firsthand." Michael had always been perceptive, with an intuitive understanding of human dynamics that complemented his analytical abilities. While his cousins had inherited various specific talents from their parents, Michael seemed to combine traits from both sides of the family. Harold's charismatic confidence tempered by my methodical precision. "Not a revolution," I corrected, gently. "A restoration of proper order," he grinned, dropping into one of the visitor chairs with the casual ease of youth. "The financial blogs are calling it the Blackwell Reclamation. There's a whole Reddit thread analyzing how you outmaneuvered Grandpa. Some users are calling you the Queen of Wall Street." I winced slightly at the sensationalism. I'd prefer they focus on the strategic realignment rather than personalized narratives. "That's not how the internet works, Grandma," he laughed. "People love drama, especially when it involves billionaires, betrayal, and justice. You're going viral whether you like it or not." Though I found the public fascination with the personal aspects of the transition distasteful, I recognized its utility. The attention created opportunities to reshape the conversation around women in finance, to highlight the systemic imbalances that had allowed my contributions to remain unacknowledged for decades. "Have you spoken to Grandpa?" Michael asked, his tone softening. "Not directly," I admitted. "His attorneys have communicated his acceptance of the advisory position, but he's requested a brief period of professional distance before assuming the role." Translation: Harold's pride required time to heal before he could function in a subordinate position to the woman he had relegated to the background for 50 years. And Veronica? Relocated to Los Angeles, according to Elizabeth's sources, apparently pursuing opportunities in venture capital. Michael shook his head. "She miscalculated badly." "She's young," I responded with unexpected empathy. "Ambition without wisdom often leads to strategic errors. Perhaps this experience will prove instructive." My grandson studied me with curiosity. "You're not bitter about her role in all this?" The question deserved consideration. Veronica had been the catalyst for Harold's departure, the immediate cause of the personal betrayal that had triggered these sweeping changes. Yet without her intervention, I might have continued in my supporting role indefinitely, my contributions permanently overshadowed by Harold's carefully cultivated public image. "In a strange way, I owe her a debt of gratitude," I acknowledged. "She created the circumstances that allowed me to reclaim my rightful position. Whether that was her intention is irrelevant to the outcome." Michael grinned. "That's what makes you formidable, Grandma. You never take anything personally when it's really about strategy." His observation was perceptive but not entirely accurate. I had indeed taken Harold's betrayal personally. How could one not after 50 years of partnership? But I had channeled that personal hurt into strategic action rather than emotional reaction. The distinction was subtle, but significant. Our conversation shifted to Michael's studies and his emerging interest in behavioral economics, a field that analyzed how psychological factors influenced financial decisions. His enthusiasm reminded me of Harold in our early years, before success had calcified his thinking into rigid patterns that prioritized personal recognition over genuine innovation. After Michael departed, I found myself reflecting on legacy, not just the financial empire I had reclaimed, but the multi-generational impact of this transformation. My grandchildren would grow up seeing their grandmother recognized as a financial strategist and industry leader. For them, women in positions of power would not be exceptional, but expected. The narrative had been corrected not just for me, but for all who would follow. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my home, now legally mine alone under the settlement terms. Margaret, Jonathan, and Elizabeth attended with their spouses. Amara joined as both colleague and friend. Lawrence came with his wife of 52 years. The occasion was understated but significant, the first social gathering of my inner circle since the transition had been completed. As we shared a meal in the dining room, where Harold and I had entertained financial luminaries and political leaders for decades, I found myself experiencing an unfamiliar sense of lightness. The weight of being perpetually overlooked, of having my contributions systematically minimized, had been so constant that I had ceased to notice its presence, until it was removed. "To my mother," Margaret proposed, raising her glass, "who taught us that true power lies not in claiming credit, but in creating value, and that sometimes the two must eventually align." As glasses clinked in response, I allowed myself to fully embrace what had been accomplished. This wasn't merely a personal triumph or financial coup. It was the correction of an extended injustice, the restoration of truth after decades of carefully constructed mythology. "To alignment," I responded, completing the toast. "And to the foundations that make all structures possible." The company announcement the following morning made it official. Blackwell Strategic Partners would henceforth be known as Blackwell and Blackwell Partners, acknowledging both founders in name as they should have been acknowledged in practice for the past 50 years. 3 years passed with remarkable swiftness. Under my leadership, Blackwell and Blackwell Partners flourished beyond even the most optimistic projections. Our assets under management grew by 47%. Our proprietary risk management algorithms became industry benchmarks, and our visibility initiative was featured in Harvard Business Review as a transformative approach to talent recognition within financial institutions. The raw numbers were impressive, but I found greater satisfaction in the subtler indicators of change. Women now occupied 43% of senior positions throughout the organization, not through arbitrary quotas, but through the meritocratic systems I had implemented to identify genuine contribution. The cultural transformation was equally profound. Teams collaborated with unprecedented transparency, innovation flourished in previously stagnant divisions, and employee retention reached historic highs. On a personal level, the changes were equally significant. I had purchased a new residence, a sleek, modern penthouse overlooking Central Park that bore no resemblance to the traditional mansion Harold and I had shared. The space reflected my own aesthetic preferences, rather than the carefully curated financial titan image Harold had always insisted upon. At 71, I found myself experiencing an unexpected renaissance. Freed from the constraints of being perpetually in Harold's shadow, I discovered passions and perspectives that surprised even my children. I developed an interest in contemporary art, joined the board of the Guggenheim Museum, and even began taking piano lessons, something I had abandoned in college when Harold suggested my time would be better spent on financial analysis. My relationship with my grandchildren deepened in particularly meaningful ways. Beyond Michael's regular visits to discuss behavioral economics, Olivia frequently sought my advice on her corporate psychology research. Jennifer, Elizabeth's 17-year-old daughter, had begun interning in our quantitative analysis division during school breaks, showing remarkable aptitude for algorithmic thinking. The most profound change, however, emerged from an unexpected quarter. 6 months after the transition, I established the Eleanor Blackwell Fellowship for Women in Quantitative Finance, a program that identified promising female mathematicians and provided both financial support and mentorship opportunities. within our organization. The inaugural class of fellows included 12 extraordinary women ranging from age 22 to 58, each with unique backgrounds but sharing exceptional analytical capabilities. Over breakfasts at my penthouse, I shared with them not just technical knowledge, but the hard-earned wisdom of navigating an industry that still often relegated women to supporting roles. Create value so undeniable they cannot ignore you, I advised them, but also create structures that ensure your contributions cannot be appropriated. Excellence is necessary but insufficient. Strategic positioning is equally vital. On a bright, spring morning 3 years after Harold's departure, I was reviewing applications for the 4th fellowship class when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Harold himself stood in my reception area, requesting a few minutes of my time. I hesitated briefly before agreeing. We had maintained strictly professional contact during the transition period, communicating through attorneys and executives rather than directly. After 6 months, Harold had finally assumed the advisory position outlined in our agreement, providing periodic consultation on specific legacy clients, but otherwise maintaining his distance. Our interactions had been cordial, but minimal. He had declined invitations to board functions and industry events where we might have been prominently photographed together. The financial press had eventually lost interest in the personal drama, focusing instead on the company's impressive performance under my leadership. When Harold entered my office, I was struck by how ordinary he appeared. The commanding presence that had dominated rooms for decades had diminished considerably. He moved with the slightly hesitant gait of a man in his mid-70s, rather than the vigorous stride he had maintained well into his late 60s. "Eleanor," he greeted me with a nod. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the visitor's chair. "Would you like coffee?" He declined with a small shake of his head. "I'll be brief. I wanted to inform you personally that I'm retiring from my advisory role. Rebecca Chen has been fully briefed on all my client relationships." Rebecca was a talented senior manager who had thrived under the Visibility Initiative, finally receiving recognition for her exceptional client management skills. "I see," I responded neutrally. "May I ask what prompted this decision?" Harold was silent for a moment, looking out at the Manhattan skyline visible through my office windows. When he turned back, his expression held something I had rarely seen. During our 50 years together, genuine introspection. "I've been offered a visiting professorship at Wharton," he said, teaching a seminar on investment strategy in emerging markets. "Congratulations," I offered sincerely. "You have valuable perspective to share with students." "That's just it," he replied, surprising me with his candor. "I've been re-examining exactly what that perspective encompasses and where it originated." He paused, visibly gathering his thoughts. "The truth is, Eleanor, I've been claiming credit for insights that weren't fully mine for so long that I began to believe my own narrative. The admission was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. In preparing my course materials," he continued, "I've had to deconstruct the decision-making behind our major investment strategies over the decades. The process has been illuminating and humbling." Harold reached into his briefcase and withdrew a book manuscript bound in simple black. "I've written an investment memoir. It's being published next fall." He placed it on my desk, and I noted the title, Foundations, Reconsidering Success in Modern Finance. "I'd like you to review it before publication," he said. "Not for approval. That's not my intent, but for accuracy. I've attempted to properly credit the collaborative nature of what we built, but I suspect there are contributions I'm still overlooking." I regarded the manuscript with measured interest. "That's thoughtful of you, Harold." "It's not thoughtfulness," he corrected. "It's long overdue honesty. The financial world should understand how our success actually materialized, not just for your recognition, which you've now rightfully claimed, but for the accurate education of the next generation." The gesture represented something I had never expected from Harold. Genuine acknowledgement of the fundamental imbalance that had characterized our professional relationship. Not under duress of legal pressure or financial necessity, but as a voluntary act of historical correction. "I'll review it," I agreed. "And I appreciate the intention behind it." Harold nodded, then added with uncharacteristic hesitation, "There's something else. The university has suggested a companion lecture from you on risk architecture and quantitative modeling. The students would benefit enormously from your perspective, particularly the women in the program who rarely see female leaders in quantitative finance." The invitation represented a different kind of acknowledgement, not just of past contributions, but of continuing relevance and authority. Coming from Harold, who had spent decades positioning himself as the sole expert in our partnership, it carried particular significance. "I'll consider it," I said, neither accepting nor declining immediately. "My schedule is rather full these days." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "So I've gathered. The fellowship program is generating considerable attention. 3 of your first-year fellows are being recruited by Goldman Sachs, I'm told." 4, I corrected. "Though I believe at least 2 will stay with us. We offer more than just compensation." An awkward silence settled between us. 2 people who had shared 50 years of marriage and professional partnership now navigating an entirely reconfigured relationship. "You've created something remarkable here, Eleanor," Harold finally said, gesturing to encompass not just my office, but the transformed organization beyond its walls, something more authentic and sustainable than what existed before. "Yes," I agreed simply. "I have." After Harold departed, I sat with his manuscript for several minutes without opening it. The gesture itself, regardless of its content, represented a form of victory more meaningful than the financial reclamation I had engineered. He had finally seen me. I turned to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline we had both helped shape through our investments and developments over the decades. The buildings stood as concrete manifestations of financial power, but the true legacy would be the institutional structures I was now creating, transparent, meritocratic systems that would endure beyond any individual. That evening, I hosted a small gathering for the fellowship recipients at my penthouse. As these brilliant women shared their research and ambitions, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The reclamation of my own contributions had evolved into something far more significant, the creation of pathways for others whose talents might otherwise remain in the shadows. "Dr. Blackwell," asked Sophia Rodriguez, a particularly promising fellow specializing in machine learning applications for market prediction, "what do you consider your greatest achievement?" The question gave me pause. The financial empire I had reclaimed was substantial by any measure. The algorithmic innovations I had developed had transformed investment methodology across the industry. The public recognition I now received, including my recent selection for the Lifetime Achievement Award that Harold had once accepted with minimal acknowledgement of my role, validated decades of overlooked contribution. Yet none of these represented the achievement I valued most. "Visibility," I answered finally. "Not just my own, but creating systems where value can't be separated from recognition, where contribution automatically confers appropriate credit. The financial world operates on accurate valuation of assets. It's long overdue that we apply the same principle to human capital." Later, after my guests had departed, I opened Harold's manuscript and began to read. The foreword contained a dedication that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "To Eleanor Blackwell, the true architect of our success, whose brilliance I failed to properly acknowledge for 50 years. This belated recognition cannot correct past injustice, but perhaps it can ensure that future generations understand the truth. Behind many great men stand women whose contributions are not lesser but often greater, not supportive, but fundamental. The financial world I navigated was built on foundations I claimed but did not create. This is my attempt to correct the record. I closed the book, feeling something I hadn't expected to experience again regarding Harold, a sense of closure. The empire I had reclaimed was never truly the prize. It was the recognition, the correction of the historical record, the establishment of truth after decades of carefully constructed mythology. I had not just reclaimed a portfolio, I had reclaimed my rightful place in the narrative, not as Harold, Blackwell's wife, but as Eleanor Blackwell, financial architect and strategist, whose vision and expertise had built a dynasty that would now endure under her rightful name. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.